they're still, for the most part, raw commodity economies. And so when you industrialize but don't change your underlying economic fabric, you get a really good burst of growth for 20, 30 years, and then it just stops. And with the exception of, say, the Northeast Asian tigers like Taiwan and Korea that have made that transition, whether you are in Brazil or Nigeria or even increasingly South Africa, the jump was never made. The 80s, the 90s, and especially the 2000s were great growth decades. But by the time you get to the 2010s, it kind of started to fall apart. And now in the 2020s, it's gone and they just haven't made the jump. Now, they did kind of have the deck stacked against them. They paid for a lot of this industrialization with borrowed money from the advanced economies, and they all have had some sort of debt crisis, which definitely held them back. But the bigger issue is China. China used predatory industrial policies to basically gobble up the industrial capacity of all of these developing countries and moved all that industrial plant to China. The country that has suffered by far the most from that policy is Brazil, where in the 2000s, the Chinese went into Brazil, established joint ventures with all of these companies that were actually solid, maybe even world leading in their sectors. The Chinese stole all the technologies, took them back to China, built up an industrial plant that was subsidized to compete with the Brazilians on the global stage, and not only destroyed the ability of the Brazilians to export to the global market, ultimately flooded Brazil with Chinese product and destroyed those companies at home as well. Once that is done, the Brazilians today would have to start over, but they have to start over with a demographic that has changed as well. Just as the Chinese and everyone else has aged, that has happened in the developing world as well, just starting from a later point. Now, we're nowhere near the point that the Chinese or the Germans at. This is not the last decade for countries like Turkey or Indonesia or Brazil. But they are aging at nearly the same rate as the Europeans, almost as fast as the Chinese. And if they can't find a way to change that underlying economic model in the next 20 years, then they're going to be facing exactly the same sort of demographic pressures that the Europeans and the Chinese are facing today. It's not all the same for everybody, but all the trends are there, just wrapped up in a slightly different picture. And it does mean that for the remainder of the first half of this century, we're looking at most of the growth patterns that were established that were very, very fast at the beginning of the century simply falling apart because there's no demographic wherewithal to carry them forward, or the countries haven't been able to modernize and diversify their economic structures enough to get out of the commodity rut. And that is a pretty dark picture for a lot of countries. There just aren't enough that have made the transition in order to carry us all along.